All right, y'all, welcome back to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. And I've got another fire conversation and another fire interview for you guys today. But before I bring on my guests, I got to remind you, you know what I'm going to say. You got to like this, you got to share this, and you must subscribe. That way you'll be updated whenever I upload a new episode. Also, be sure to check out my Substack. It's called Chasing Liberty at libertychasers.com, where I talk about all things liberty, local politics, and stuff that's going on in Washington that shouldn't be going on. But today, we're going to talk about the YMCA of all things. You know, it used to be fun to stay there, according to a popular song, but according to my guess, it might not be that much fun for some folks, especially in light of this whole issue with gender ideology. Now, I have with me Ms. Alleigh Marre from the American Parents Coalition, Executive Director of the American Parents Coalition, to talk about this issue. Your organization discovered some rather disturbing things about what the YMCA is doing. So first off, welcome to the program. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Great, great. Now, before we get into this, why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself, on your organization, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so our organization, the American Parents Coalition, we have two main goals. And the first is to protect parental rights and also to reclaim parental authority. And those things kind of go hand in hand. Firmly believe that nothing should stand between a parent and a child, and that we are the ones who should be making those determining decisions on how our kids are raised. Of course, there are going to be cultural and educational influences, but when it comes right down to values and who holds the keys to our kids' minds and hearts, that's got to be parents. So through that lens, one thing our organization does is we pay very close attention to what's going on, oftentimes in these like soft spaces, in education, in public places, where there isn't necessarily very clean black and white legislative action or authority, where some of these institutions can kind of take advantage of having access to the hearts and minds of our kids. Enter the YMCA. And so one thing our organization does to communicate that to parents is somewhat frequently, once or twice a month, we'll send out an email that goes deeper than a newsletter. We'll flag an issue like this. We'll tell parents what's going on, but what's a little bit different than other organizations is we'll say what we're doing, but we'll also give you a bunch of resources for how you can talk about it and affect change in your household today. For two reasons. The first, not everything should have or has a legislative fix. And second, all of these things start at home, and you need to be the person who's empowered to have these conversations with your kids, especially if they're uncomfortable things, like gender, sexuality. That stuff's got to start at home so that our kids aren't only getting it from the outside. So we give you the resources to have those kind of kitchen table conversations, and to be that value driver in your kid's life.
Yeah, and see, and that's important because a lot of organizations focus mainly on the legislative aspect of this. And I'm not really knocking that. I mean, in a lot of these cases, there might
Yeah.
need to be some government intervention, but parents need to be empowered. They need to know what to do to shield their children from a lot of this propaganda that they're being exposed to in schools, but also in a lot of other institutions like we're about to talk about. So tell me, what's going on with the YMCA?
So we noticed over the last several months to a year that there had been a lot of public complaints kind of scattered throughout the country, typically from women complaining about seeing males in the locker room, either undressing or oogling them, a couple instances of, on swim teams and things like that. So we started to pay a little bit of attention to that, of course. It was a little bit murky because we started following this during the Biden administration when Title IX had been changed, and there was rightfully some confusion broadly in the policy in that space. President Trump took care of that when he took office in January, gave a very clear, decisive, direct executive action, and he tied federal funding to that. So that made us hone in and pay closer attention to the YMCA and what policies and practices were occurring in the post January 25th world. And we noticed that not much changed, unfortunately. There were still several websites across the country for these YMCA's saying that their policy was that men who believed that they were women could undress in women's bathrooms. Essentially, their broad policy was that gender and your sex is determined based on how an individual feels, and a person should have access to the bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, camps, etc., that they identify with. So very much pulling from that previous administration's language. And we saw that all over the place, from summer camps to locker rooms, all across the YMCA, indeterminate of the kids' ages. And so that was where we started from. We sent a note to all of our parent subscribers to let them know that this was going on and to provide them with some resources to call their local YMCA. And we gave a script and some questions that they could ask to understand whether or not this would be the case in their local community.
So I know YMCA has a bunch of different chapters, right? Are they all having this policy, or do some have it and others don't? Or can you break that down a little bit?
Sure. So essentially, on the YMCA National, the YUSA's website, they have recently taken the position that they don't provide guidance on that. Now, here's where it gets a little bit interesting. We sent out this communication about 2 weeks ago. And the day after we did that, the Y took down a ton of pages, or put behind password protected a ton of pages on their website, everything that we had pulled that showed that this was their guidance. So they had all kinds of pages up and blog posts from how your local YMCA can celebrate Pride and how you can create a gender inclusive camp, et cetera. And they were giving this as resources to all of the YMCA's across the country for them to implement in their branches. Now, their national policy, they say we don't provide guidance on.
Mhm.
However, the absence of guidance leaves the branches up to interpretation based on all of their recommendations. So they may try and split hairs and say that that's not our quote policy, but it is their recommendation. Until we told the world that that was their recommendation, they decided to scrub it. Again, not change their policy, to scrub it. So from there, we sent a letter to the three agencies in the administration who have provided federal funding to the YMCA. The Y, in addition to influencing 4 million kids and teens across the country, they have a $600 million federal grant budget. So that's not like pocket change, and that's taxpayer money, which would very clearly be tied to compliance with Title IX, which they are not doing. So we sent a letter to HHS, to HUD, and to the Department of Education asking them to review their grants and contracts with the YMCA, and in light of understanding what their policy was and how it was being carried out in various branches across the country.
Okay. And so you mentioned having males in women's locker rooms and bathrooms. How else is this manifesting with the YMCA? Like what other spaces are being invaded here?
Yeah, I think the biggest area where we're seeing the outspoken issues is, of course, the bathrooms and locker rooms, because there's where you have the most, privacy violations. We've of course also heard about it on sports teams, but the other place where there's a big privacy violation is in camps. And there's a handful across the country who not only is their policy in line with gender ideology, defining how they determine housing arrangements, but they promote that. So they'll say, if your child feels this way, this camp is a safe place, we are gender inclusive. So it's not just oh, this is part of the camp and we're going to accommodate those kids. It's a badge of pride. And it is something that is promoted in their materials as to being like a selling point within the community. So they'll have, you could be bunked with a boy as a young girl. And there are also, in many of these places, no parental notification requirements. So if I send my daughter, who is my daughter, to this camp, she could be bunked and roomed with a male who identifies as a female, and no one would tell me about it.
Mm.
On top of that, the thing that really concerns me most as a parent is coaches, counselors, and supervisors who may identify as transgender who have access to these private places for minors. So the swim coach could identify as transgender and be in there with 15, 10-year-old girls watching them all change, and no one would tell me about that. And so these are the areas where we really wanted to make sure that we made parents aware that this is a very broad, um, if you want to give the YMCA grace, open to interpretation policy, kind of free for all, where they've said, okay, every branch can kind of do their own thing, because they've refused to say our organizations must comply with Title IX, which is a very easy thing to say. There's a reason they haven't said it. And so that was where we felt it was really important for us to step in and make sure that parents understood, especially it's camp season. All the kids are out of school. Everyone's signing up for those summer camps. I know in a lot of places, my community, especially, there are a lot of moms who are relying on that for summer childcare, and experiences for their kids. So it's a flux point that we wanted to make sure parents were aware of.
So here's my question. I mean, like you said, it would be easy for them to just say, "Hey, you know what? We're going to comply with what the law says." Why I know you can't read minds, but why are they so hesitant to do this? Or are they true believers in gender ideology? Maybe they're backing down to the mob, or what do you think is motivating this?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. As part of this exercise, we went back to 2018, 2020, and we're looking at just how their policy and guidance changed overall. They very much bought into a lot of the DEI narratives around the same time as the gender ideology stuff. So I think that they probably were receiving some pretty heavy pressure
Mm.
from the quote mob. And oftentimes, and we'll accept blame for this, the conservative side of the aisle isn't as loud. I think because a lot of times we take for granted that we see much of this as common sense.
Mhm.
And so when there's only one side that is screaming in their ear, threatening funding, threatening, a bad score from, HRC or whatever the organization is, people get scared and they change their policy and they back down. And if they don't hear from organizations like ours and parents, who are part of our organization across the country, then they don't really have any reason to push back because no one's telling them to. So I would like to think of us as being, sitting here raising our hand saying, hey, we care. And when the mob comes after you, you can say that there are just as many people on the other side who care about girls' safety, who care about fairness in sports, who care about privacy and dignity and having a safe space to undress. And you can keep the policy the way it has been since the beginning of time. And you will have plenty of people in your corner backing you up to do the right thing and to, if nothing else, follow federal law and protect your funding. I mean, if that's not enough reason, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I think what we've seen, I'd say over the past decade is, that saying the squeaky wheel gets the grease, that has become very obvious over the past 10 years or so, especially I'd say even over the past 1 or 2 years, where you have a lot of companies moving away from a lot of the far leftist progressive ideology on sexuality and gender. I mean, when people make it known that we don't approve of this, then they got to listen to one side or the other, and they're going to listen to the side that's the loudest and the one that they perceive as most powerful. And up until this point, it has seemed that the far left has been the loudest and held the most power. But I've been seeing a lot of this crumble. Is that what you've been seeing too? Or, obviously the YMCA, this is still an issue. It's not gone, but I am seeing waning
Yeah.
support for a lot of this effort to force gender ideology on other people.
I completely agree. And I think the fact that within hours of us raising this complaint publicly, the fact that the Y scrubbed all this from their website shows that they know that if nothing else, they need to take a step back and take a hard look at this. Because to your point, the attitude is shifting. And even, I mean, it's no secret. You look at any public poll on this, it's truly an 80-20, if not more severe issue. we did some polling up in Maine of all places, of course, a pretty blue place, because there were having some Title IX issues in that state as it related to girls track. We did some polling to just kind of get a feel for, we know what it is nationally, but what is it on the ground in these more blue places? And all of the results that we got back were north of 60, 65. So even in a place like Maine, more than 60% of people agree that sports should be segregated by sex, and that you should be competing against people in your biological sex. And then some of the other stuff as it relates to parental notification, like if a student goes to school and decides that they want to go by a different name and pronouns, should parents be proactively notified? We were north of 75% said yes in a state like Maine. So this is a very, if you're talking about any political issue, it really truly doesn't get more straightforward than one like this. And that's not spin, that's data. And if the Y wants to talk, I'm happy to share all our data.
Yeah, I'm sure the true believers won't be interested, but it is interesting because we talk about how divided the nation is on many issues, and it's true. On this one, not so much. I mean, maybe in certain areas of the country, people might be
Yeah,
more divided, but people generally agree that, sports should be segregated. Like you said, women shouldn't be forced to compete against biological males. Biological males shouldn't be up in women's locker rooms, especially in the case of the YMCA, where like you said, a biological male who identifies as trans, an adult, could be in a locker room with young girls.
yeah.
Uh, so my question is, you sent this letter to Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Education Department. Um, have they responded yet, or is there any sense that they're taking a look at this? Or
They've not responded to us yet. We just sent this last week, so I imagine things take a little bit of time to get through the appropriate channels there. But it's definitely not something that we intend to just let sit. We have a handful of other, items that are looking forward to bringing, more into the forefront over the next couple of weeks in the summer. Perhaps some paid advertising that we're exploring, and some other stuff to continue the momentum with this, because like we were just discussing, it's not a fringe issue. It's extremely important. And I don't want to see it get to a point where someone's daughter is adversely affected physically or traumatized, beyond what we're already seeing in the women who are already complaining about this, at the Y. So it's something that we intend to continue to bang the drum on until somebody helps us fix it.
okay, okay, and since each chapter can, I guess, decide which policy they want to impose, with the ones that are pushing the gender ideology, are you seeing this more in red states or in blue states, or would you say it's about the same across the board?
It's actually a pretty even mix. There are a lot of places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it, where perhaps they have, a board member or two who are a little bit more to the left and have the influence to be able to change the policy. And one thing that I would also like to raise is in the places where we have seen publicly reported instances where women do stand up to bring it forward, oftentimes it's the woman who is retaliated against.
Hmm.
It's not even, hey, let's find a solution that works for everybody. And which, we have a solution that works for everybody, but that's beside the point. There's isn't even like placating language. The reprimanding and the punishment is in favor of the woman. So there was a case in Washington state where an 80-something-year-old woman came to the front desk and was like, hey, there's a man changing in here and he's Googling these teenage girls. And she got kicked out of the Y. They revoked her membership, and she's no longer, a member at the Y. It's wild. It's absolutely wild. And we've seen that in a handful of places across the US, where someone does stick their neck out and say, hey, this is wrong. Hey, this makes me uncomfortable. And the establishment, the Y, is taking the side of the transgender person instead of the woman. And it's not our job to make a man feel comfortable in a private space. Like, that's on you.
Yeah, well, it's amazing to me because I mean, And that's what I meant when I said earlier about them trying to force this ideology on other people. I understand that the YMCA isn't
Yeah.
the government. They can't throw you in a cage. They can't do anything like that. But there are ways that they can compel people or coerce people into accepting this. They could have made an example of this woman that says, if you speak out, you're not going to be allowed here anymore. Your kids aren't going to be allowed here anymore. And that's really a huge problem, especially because most people don't agree with this. They almost have to use force because persuasion doesn't work. You can't persuade the average American that an adult male belongs in a girl's locker room at the YMCA. So, I mean, it's amazing that they even
Yeah.
think that they can get away with this. I mean, it might even be why they scrub their websites, trying to avoid liability. But realistically, I mean, how much longer do you think they can avoid actually dealing with this issue?
I'm hopeful it's not very long. And, thanks to you and others who have had me on or covered what we've put out so far to help kind of keep this drumbeat alive. And we intend to continue to talk about it and, scream it from the rooftops until they're forced to respond. They did, for the first time, the end of last week, they did respond to a media organization who had requested comment. Up to that point, they had completely stonewalled and just ignored it. So we are getting to a point where they're at least forced to respond, which is a good thing.
Mhm.
And hopefully we're able to kind of pull those pieces out from here forward and get them to actually change their policy, not just remove it. But to me, that shows that's an admission of guilt, that there's an understanding that there's something there to be hidden.
Mhm.
At least that's what my parents taught me when I hit a bad test grade in my bottom of my backpack as a kid.
Yeah, you got busted, didn't you?
Yeah, sure did.
So, have you seen any examples of abuse resulting from this type of policy? I mean, already having a grown man in a girl's locker room and ogling them, I mean, if you're a young girl going
Yeah.
through that, that's going to have at least a level of traumatization. But have you seen more overt examples or more, extreme examples?
Not publicly. We have not seen any reporting of, a certain physical abuse happening in any of these places. To my knowledge, most of what has been reported publicly has been, the more traumatic feelings of being looked at and watched as you're undressing and, uncomfortable in those spaces, having boys on the basketball court with girls, etc. Which, to your point, can be and is just as damaging if someone is, staring at you as you undress. It's an extremely vulnerable position and place to be, and it's why these spaces have existed since their establishment, so that girls could be in one place and have privacy to change, and boys in another.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, I remember it's funny. This was popping in my head. I just remembered this, and I blame you for bringing this memory up. I was at the YMCA as a kid a long time ago, and I was in the boys area, and we were changing clothes. We kept our underwear on, but there was this old guy in there, and he just gets buck naked, and I was like I didn't say anything, but inside I was like, why is this dude naked? I mean, it was more
Yeah.
normal back then. I mean, for guys to change in front of each other. But even then, I was like, this is wild. But if I were a young girl and seen this guy, especially this guy,
Yeah.
ugh, it would have to be it's disturbing. It's amazing to
Yeah.
me that.
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just to say, you bring up another point where you're talking a lot about like sex segregated spaces, but the age is an interesting dynamic as well, because as you're recalling, just seeing someone your own sex but significantly older than you is an uncomfortable feeling in your core. It can be like an icky feeling. Now add the gender and size dynamic to that. Imagine a 7, 8, 9-year-old girl who's in the Y for a summer camp, and she's taken off her bathing suit, and you have a 20-something-year-old transgender counselor who's in there with them, or just an adult male who happens to be changing in the bathroom, and the swim team, comes in and they're changing as well. So you have the age dynamic, you have the sex dynamic, you have the sheer like size and strength of the male body compared to female, which if you're nude in a locker room is on full display, and you're going to feel even more vulnerable and violated. And I don't think that it's the intent of the YMCA to provide that. I know for me personally, some of my greatest growth as an individual came from my experiences at the Y as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I went on to play college basketball, and I was at the Y every single day when I was a kid for 3+ hours a day. I spent my entire childhood there. And I think that's part of why it bothers me so much to see this, because I know what a positive impact the Y has had in so many people's lives and can have in a community. And to see that be thrown away because they've been captured by this ideology in the mob, and to see like families like mine who will step back from organizations like that because of this promotion of the ideology, it's just a sad state of affairs.
So here's a question. I mean, if this had gone down, like say in the 80s or the 90s, there would be a huge uproar. Like once parents found out, like there'd be pitchforks and torches. Why aren't, and I'm not saying, I'm not advocating for that just for the people who are watching this. I'm just saying that's what would have happened. Why aren't more people speaking out? Because I'm sure if I went to the average parent, a father or a mother, and said, "Hey, your daughter's going to be sharing a locker room with boys, maybe even adult coaches, male coaches," what would they do? They would raise hell. But why aren't people raising hell about this issue? I mean, I've seen an increase over the years, but it just seems like they've just been able to do this without anybody really saying anything. Are they not aware of this, or what's going on here?
I think so. I'd like to go on record that I lasted a half an hour without going after the media. But now to go after the media, it's been 2-3 years of this where public opinion, to your point, has become really solidified in this being an 80/20 issue, and we still haven't gotten honest coverage from the quote legacy media on this. I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I will give credit to the New York Times on 2 or 3 occasions has tried to bring forward a handful of stories and experiences more sympathetic to our side of the ledger on this. But of course, always with 14 paragraphs of caveat ahead of that. But and they got lit up for it, like they had I believe it was HRC, but some of those organizations send them some really nasty letters. And there was more coverage from the legacy media of the nasty letters that the New York Times received for writing an almost honest piece than what it was that the New York Times was covering. And for example, like the New York Times put out a piece, I believe it was October of last year, where they interviewed one of the gender surgeons out of one of the University of California system centers for gender transition and therapies.
Mhm.
And she had said that there was a study that had been commissioned and paid for by the government to look into long-term effects of this quote gender affirming care, and that there was like the results were quote mixed. It was a mixed bag, but they hadn't released the study publicly for fear of political retribution.
Right.
So like de facto admitting that the data is not there to continue doing this. And it was the New York Times who got lit up for publishing that story, not going after the university system for hiding this data, which still is not public to this day, almost a year later, is still not public. So to get back to your original question, I think a lot of it is it's still easy for people to believe that it's a fringe issue. And on something that is this big of a deal and hits this close to home, I think a lot of parents who may be on our side, which is 80%, for this, think it can't happen here.
Mm.
And that's a very dangerous way to think. And they think it can't happen here because there hasn't been a problem from it here. And I'll use, our public school system as an example. In our previous residence, we were determining where we were going to send our kids to school. And I met with the principal of our of our elementary school, and I asked her point blank some of these questions,
Mhm.
and she said, this is the policy, it's gender identity, et cetera. And I said, so what stops a fifth grade boy from going into the bathroom with my kindergarten girl? And I will give her credit, like she wasn't hiding the ball, and the policy was what it was, and she said, this is the policy. um, and I have a ton of friends who I know share my opinion on this, who still send their kids to school
Mm.
in that district because it hasn't been a problem there. And so I guess my big message whenever I feel it's appropriate to have this conversation with friends and peers is like, don't wait for the problem. Don't wait for the problem, because the problem can be with and affect your child. Um, and so we are constantly advocating for parents to have those conversations with school administrators, at doctors' offices, with their sports teams, and especially for those bodies that aren't necessarily governed by Title IX, like private sports leagues and stuff like that. So I think it's kind of twofold. First is that the quote legacy media hasn't given it its honest day in court and coverage, and then the second is because it's almost like a reverse psychology type thing where because the stakes are so high, most parents want to believe that it won't affect them because nothing bad has happened yet, and they kind of just keep their head in the sand, and then things blow up and they're like, how did this happen? Or it couldn't happen here. And so that's why we keep ringing the alarm on these from the outside.
Yeah, I see a lot of what you're describing in red states, honestly. I mean, people think, oh, I live in a red state.
Yeah,
Can't happen here. And I keep telling them, look, remember when there was that big fear about drag queen story or drag queen performances for kids? Where were most of those reports
yeah,
coming from? Bright red Texas. Yeehaw. Like that it happens in red
yeah,
states all the
yeah.
time. And that's why I asked you that question earlier. It happens in blue states, definitely. It's happening in red states too. So if you're in a red state, don't think for a second that the YMCA or other institutions aren't doing these things. And you do want to nip the problem in the bud before it becomes a bigger issue. But I also, I mean, and I know a lot of folks on the right won't take this approach that I'm about to take, but you know, there are people who do suffer from gender dysphoria, and I do believe that we should have sympathy for them. I think that, nobody wants to see people being excluded, but you also have to protect other children as well. What would you say to those who refer to this or characterize this as some type of animus against trans identified folks or discrimination, even?
I'm really glad you bring that up, because it's a conversation I have a lot in my social circles. Um, and I think both of those things, there's a tension there, but it can coexist and in a positive way. So, do I want a transgender person changing their clothes in a locker room next to my daughter? Absolutely not. If
Hmm.
there's a transgender student in my child's class, invite them to your birthday party. Let's have a play date. Like there are so many ways that we can and should be quote inclusive, because to your point, some of these kids, especially when we're talking about youth, are the kids who need a hug more than anybody else. They're clearly struggling with something. And we should go out of our way to make sure that those kids are a part of our lives, of everyone's lives, and feel loved by the people around them. But it is not love to put other people's children and other children at risk for a individual who is struggling with something on their own. That is something that needs to be handled between that child, their doctor, their family, and it doesn't need to be effectuating what's going on with the rest of the classroom in the school. So absolutely include those kids in birthday parties, in tag playground games, whatever. I mean, kids are kids.
Yeah, everything else. Yeah.
But that doesn't Exactly. That does not mean that their physical safety is at risk on sports teams, fairness is at risk on sports teams, and privacy and dignity is at risk in a locker room or a bathroom.
Gotcha. Now, I believe that the YMCA, they say they also offer optional private changing spaces if the parents request it. What do you think of a solution like that?
I think that that's a great solution for the individual who identifies as transgender, to make the girl be the one who has to request that, seek that out, and be the one who is othered is just completely inappropriate. So if that is a avenue that the transgender student or child wants to pursue, I think that that's a great, that's a great opportunity and solution for them. Or they can change in their, sex-based space.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. You have a section if you're not really sure about your gender. This is where you can go change. Or when it comes to restrooms, like Starbucks. Starbucks just has a restroom that you walk in. It's not like public. Only one person goes in. It doesn't matter what gender they are. There's not even
Yep.
a need to have them labeled as male or female. It's just it's a restroom. There are ways around this. There are ways to have solutions that accommodate everybody. I mean, I remember a coach, I think he was in Oregon, and they were talking about the sports issue, and he recommended having maybe a separate type of sports for trans-identified individuals or things like that, just for even suggesting something like that, not even trying to impose it, just saying maybe this might work. They fired him. So
Yeah.
this this is my tinfoil hat.
Cheers.
This proves that this is an effort to push gender ideology, not necessarily to provide solutions that work for everybody. It's like, no, you can't do that. We absolutely must have biological males in girl spaces. I mean, am I going too far with that, or am I too much of a tinfoil hat guy here, or is there something to that?
I'm so steeped in this every day that, I tend to move that direction as well. One thing I thought was really interesting, and this actually came from that same conversation with our, previous residents, where our daughter would have been zoned to go to school. She told me, because I asked that question. I said, well, what prevents this happening in her bathroom? She said, well, we have a handful of these like single stall spaces in the front of the school. And if she's uncomfortable and you say that, we can send her there. I said, well, why would she be the one to go there? And then I said, this is a brand new school. If you knew this was a problem or, going to become this big issue, like, why wouldn't you just make all the bathrooms that? And she actually brought something up that I had never thought of before. And she said that they have to have the restrooms in the way that we're traditionally used to seeing them for students, where you walk into a room and then there's the stalls,
Mhm.
because you need to be able to see the feet at the bottom, because there's all kinds of like bullying, or if someone,
Mhm.
shoves some kid into the bathroom to like beat them up or to sexually assault them or whatever it is, anyone else who's in the restroom would know or see that. Or if a teacher walks in doing their like rounds, they see that there's two sets of feet on the bottom. And that had never even crossed my mind. So I think that is the Starbucks solution is a great solution for most places. But in a school and educational setting, or in a place where you're like heavy centered on kids, and the sub-18 population, it didn't sound like that was a very viable solution. And I just bring that up because I had never heard that before. I didn't even think that way. I was kind of with you, where I'm like, well, just make everything a single stall and like call it a day. But apparently that doesn't work.
Yeah. And in a context like that, it probably wouldn't. Although there doesn't mean that there aren't other solutions. There are other ways to make this
Yeah.
good for everybody, which again is why I don't believe for a second that this has anything to do with discrimination or accommodating trans-identified individuals, most of whom would actually be okay with a lot of these solutions, even trans folks. So to me, that tells me that there's more of an agenda. So with you've contacted these federal agencies, and so what is the ultimate objective here? I mean, obviously they're using the money that they take from us to fund this organization, the YMCA. Is that the main objective here, to possibly have the funding cut if they continue with this? Or are you looking for something more? Or what exactly is the overall solution that your organization is pushing for here?
Yeah, so primary objective would be to have the YMCA explicitly say that all of their branches need to comply with and follow federal law, which would be, the protection of women and girls in sports and private spaces. Um, we only ever even went to the administrative side of this because not only did they not change their policy, but then they stepped back and just removed stuff, like wholesale just deleted it. So I would love to see the Y continue to be successful and grow and be a safe place for generations to come. I cited my really positive experience with them earlier, and I would love to see any and every child have that experience. But you're on a really slippery slope if the baseline isn't there, and the baseline is privacy and safety. So absent that, we will continue to pull the strings on some of these levers that may push them to act to save their hide versus do the right thing. Obviously, we'd always advocate for the former, but you know, we'll do what we got to do and keep pushing until we get that result.
Okay. So basically, you got to make the YMCA great again, is what I'm hearing. Sorry, I had
Yeah,
to say it. I had to say it.
I know.
So,
And the
last
president loves the song, so
that's what I was thinking too. I'm like that's like the song he always
yeah,
comes out to. He's always doing that dance and all that. I'm like, that's his jam right there.
yeah.
So last question. This one focuses on the YMCA, what you're doing right now. What other things you guys got cooking right now? Are there other organizations that you're looking at, or what's next?
Yeah, we pay pretty close attention to the tech space and specifically parental controls. And we did a campaign a few months ago focused on Meta because they had the whole dust up when they released their AI chatbots that were having explicit conversations with accounts that were said to be under 13. And so we have tried to push Meta and other digital platforms into having better parental controls, especially because as a parent, when you're talking about emerging technologies, not just like the static
Mm.
Facebook as we know it to be, it's really hard to guard against technology that we don't know exist.
Yeah.
You could set as many parental controls for your kid on their device as you want, but if you don't know to put this AI chatbot on like a restricted no access page, how can you guard against that? So parental controls is a big one for us. Streaming services that have programming for kids that is of, promoting gender ideology. We're also pretty active in the transgender medical space. We did a campaign last year called Stop the Docs, where we were investigating some of the biggest hospitals across the country who had been performing these gender transition surgeries or providing, quote, gender affirming care. So this is all stuff that would preserve and protect parental rights or reclaim parental authority is where we operate traditionally.
Okay, awesome. I would like to actually have you back on sometime to talk about some of those other issues, especially like with the AI
Yeah,
issue, social media. That stuff is crazy. But I
yeah.
thank you for joining the program here. Before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you, find your work, all that good stuff.
Yeah, our website is americanparentscoalition.org. And on there, we have a page called The Lookout. And that's where we have all of our parent resources. And you can subscribe to get those. It's not spammy, it's once or twice a month tops. And again, I do think that's generally a pretty good resource and first step to kind of get these things on your radar for your family. Again, because we not only flag the issue and break down how it affects you as a family, but also provide a couple of resources for how you can act on that at home, like at your kitchen table today. So that's at americanparentscoalition.org.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on. Hopefully we can get you back on soon. And to the audience, until next time, stay free, stay principled, and most importantly, stay ungovernable.